agents. This is going to be very much like Agents 101. So I'm going to roll over all the basics that you need to know to understand agents, and maybe even start thinking about building the first one or two yourself if you want to go down that route. So firstly, I wanted to kind of like talk a little bit about, what are agents? How do they fit into the kind of world of AI? And if you think about how you interact with AI, then there's kind of three main modes or types of interaction of which agents are one. So first one, kind of most obvious one in a way, are chatbots. So these are things like Claude, like ChatGPT, like Gemini, where you've got a dedicated interface and you're going to ask it a question or say something and it's going to respond and give you something back. So that's chatbots. Second one then is assistants. So these are tools which have almost like a chatbot embedded in it, and that AI will then help you do things. But it's got the context of what you're working on, and it will help you complete tasks in that particular tool. So if you know any of the prototyping tools like Replit or Lovable, these have assistants. But a lot of other tools like Canva and Google and Microsoft are building assistants into their existing products at the moment. So this is becoming more and more um, common. And then agents are the kind of third sort of set that we've got here, or third category that we kind of see here. And what makes them different is that they don't have a dedicated interface. It's like you build your agent, but then it works behind the scenes and it works through other apps and services that you've got. So you might get an email from your agent, or you might get a Slack message from your agent, or it might update a spreadsheet for you. But it's sort of doing all these things behind the scenes. Um, and yeah, particularly for PMs, and people kind of like thinking about, okay, well, how do I categorize then all the different things that are going on? Another way of thinking about this is, you know, of the tools that you've got, then you've got general AIs. Again, these are your chatbots. These are your kind of you ask these for help with anything, writing specs, debugging stuff, brainstorming ideas. As I said, this is like Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini. These are kind of like the foundational models. Your agents are then built in tools like Relay, N8N, Zapier, Gumloop. These are typically using drag and drop components, which you can then rearrange in any way you want to create workflows and workflows with AI in, which is basically what an agent is. Prototyping tools are then a little bit different because you're putting in a text-based prompt there, and they are then building you a website. And if you get even more down that route, then um, uh, IDEs, things like Cursor, Windsurf. These are, integrated development environments. They're where you're writing kind of professional code. And so both of those two types of things, the prototyping tools, the IDEs, they're very much type assistants. Um, but they're also for building your own. They're going to build the interface as well as the kind of the back end of any digital service you're building. So common use cases for agents, like why would you have agents? I mean, like there's lots of different use cases. Um, and I've kind of just written a few down here, a few examples based on different functions. So, for sales teams, you might see agents qualifying inbound leads, doing research on inbound leads or companies, updating Salesforce, posting to Slack, kind of keeping you updated so they can do a lot of the kind of very basic work that junior salespeople will be doing, as well as like writing reports and stuff like that. On the marketing side, again, you can simply be automating a lot of sort of routine research and generation. So they might be monitoring Reddit for trending topics and then generating blog posts or social posts from these. So at the moment, I don't know if you've noticed, but on LinkedIn, you're seeing a lot of people who are taking screenshots of conversations on Reddit and writing some kind of hot take on those. And I'm fairly sure they've got agents kind of helping them through that workflow at the moment. Um, Operations, I mean, operations can cover like all sorts of things, right? But you might well see agents acting as a first line customer support. So having an agent kind of built into the product as a powering a chat box or something that's going to generate responses for customer support tickets. Productivity, this is obviously a big one. I saw someone posting in the chat, hoping to get some tips here. And for product managers, I think productivity is going to be the big bucket of stuff that is going to be useful agents wise here. So examples of agents that might be useful for you. This could be things like prepping you for meetings by looking at who's going to be in the meeting, sending out kind of briefing notes for the meeting, sending out follow-ups, sending out like weekly reports or updates, all those sorts of things. And increasingly, if you can connect to things like Jira or where you're actually doing development, then it could also be kind of pulling information from them into reports or making it available in other services like Slack or email through simple connections. Research is obviously a big one. You can do research in Claude, ChatGPT, the kind of general LLMs. But if you want to run specific reports on a regular basis, then an agent's going to be able to do that. So like run a kind of AI step or an AI capability regularly. Um, Final example here, HR systems. So if you're thinking about how can you onboard lots of people at once, you could easily have an agent that created all the accounts that they needed, sent them, a sequence of emails and Slack messages to check they're onboarded, connected them with different people, and it can do all of that work from a fairly simple setup then. So here are just some ideas of like what you could use agents for. Um, if we think a bit about, okay, well, again, like what are agents? How do they differ from workflows? I think of agents as on a sort of continuum with workflows. And a kind of Zapier, very basic workflow has a simple if this, then that kind of logic. It's going to have a deterministic output, fairly easy to kind of set up and debug. As you start putting in LLM steps, like AI, generative AI steps into this linear flow, then you get to a simple agent. And that's important because it allows you to both kind of tackle much more complex use cases, which require personalized content or generated content. It allows you to use judgment where the LLM is then in the flow and is kind of making a call about what to do next based on kind of effectively like fuzzy logic or non-deterministic logic. And as you build those things up, then you get to a state where what anyone would call is like definitely an agent. If you're using like multiple LLM steps, if you're using nonlinear flows, if you're using LLM, to decide how to proceed, everyone's going to class this as an agent. Where exactly is that boundary? I mean, it doesn't really matter because you are going to build agents and in the same tools as you would build workflows in. And so, whether you call it an agent or not, or whether you call it an agent or workflow it's kind of like doesn't have any kind of practical application or kind of relevance. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. And throughout this kind of talk, I'm going to use these terms very interchangeably in that sense. So if I say agent or if I say workflow, it means exactly the same thing. So very basically, if you're looking at what a kind of basic agent looks like, it might look something like this. Okay, so this is in Relay. Relay is one of these services that we really like because the user interface is very clean. It's very simple. If you're looking to build simple agents, then this is definitely where I would start out. So the first thing you'll see at the top is a trigger. So every workflow, every agent has a trigger that is what starts things going. Because as we said before, what makes agents different from assistants and chatbots is that they're not triggered by the user, they're triggered by something else. And I'll talk a bit about what the other triggers might be. They might be on a schedule, they might be on triggered by external services, but you're going to have something that sets the workflow going. You're then going to have a series of steps here, which basically like process and output information. Okay, so you can see here we've got one with Gmail, get some emails, some calendar, looks at Google Calendar, look up recent meetings, all this sort of thing. And then you can see it down at the bottom, there's an AI step, where basically we're making an API call to OpenAI saying like, hey, given all this stuff, we want you to kind of process it and then send an email. So this whole sequence is basically a flow that I have running that sends me a briefing on for meetings that include external guests. And you can see inside of this, there's actually some routing logic. So it's it looks fairly linear. This has a kind of a simple loop in it. So for any meeting with external guests, it will loop over all the external guests and do research on each of those. But you can have other routing logic like delays. You can have a sort of different pathways and if else knows that's that sort of thing, which then give your agents a lot more complexity. And again, I'll kind of go into a little bit more detail on, or I'll show you some examples of some much more complicated triggers. But this is kind of like the basics of what they look like. So types of triggers. There's lots of different types of triggers that you can get. And if you open up, again, this is a screenshot from Relay, but if you open up NAN or Zapier, you get the same sort of list of like, there's lots of different ways you can start your agent out. But I'd really think about this very simply as kind of like three categories. So you've got manual, like you click a button in the tool and you start it. So if you do want to have an automation that is manually triggered, you can do that. The second way is at a set time, so it like runs on a schedule. And the third way is when something happens in another digital product, right? So if something happens in Gmail or something happens in a spreadsheet or something happens on YouTube, this might be an app that you're using internally. It might be like an external website. It could be you've got, a webhook, a mail hook. You've even got an MCP server, something like this. But it's basically like something else is happening on a digital product which triggers this. So these are all kind of useful in their own right. But probably I'd say like if you're really kind of getting into agents, you're going to be using the scheduled ones, things that happen on a recurring schedule or things that happen when something happens somewhere else. For the AI steps, sometimes these are called AI agents. So if you look at NAN, they actually call the individual step, which calls an LLM, an AI agent, confusingly. So that the terms here are a little bit confused. But those steps, then a few things to bear in mind. You'll probably notice some of these things in ChatGPT or in Claude as you use your general LLMs, but they become really important when you're building agents, because when you're building an agent, you're not having a conversation, right? So you can't course correct or give more context if the LLM doesn't give you the response that you want. So you want to give it an awful lot of information and be really specific about what you want to get out of it so that it gives you what you get back. But anyway, the components of any kind of AI step, you'll see the prompt, right? This is the baseline instructions for the model, right? So everyone knows what the prompt is, right? But this is the same. The thing to remember here, as I said, is this is the same every time the workflow runs. You can have variables inside that prompt, but you're not going to change the prompt itself and you're not going to follow up. So you want to give that extra detail. Second thing then you'll have is the model, and which kind of foundational model, which kind of API call you're using to run the model on. This is something you're going to think about a lot more with agents than you will do with the latest LLMs. Now with ChatGPT, with GPT-5 out, you don't really have to think about which model you select. That's one of their big innovations. When you're building an agent, you are still going to have to think about that and make a very active choice, because the more powerful models are more expensive. And when you've got a system that can be triggered like on its own without you knowing effectively, then it's very easy to rack up a lot of costs for your API without you realizing. So thinking about what is the cheapest model to use, and then testing it and having some guardrails in there is going to be really important. Other things you can put in there are data. So this can be kind of variable information from previous steps in the workflow, or it could be standing instructions. So again, the analogy going back to something like ChatGPT, if you drop in a document or an attachment, or you have a project with some instructions in it. This is, you can do similar things in agents, right? So you have some additional context that they can refer to every time that they do something. Tools is something that agents have been using for a few months now, but is only just coming into ChatGPT and sort of the LLMs. So these are effectively, you could think of these as almost like subroutines or standalone sequences, which you can then call from another workflow or another agent. So you might have a mini sequence which goes and does an internet search, or runs a RAG kind of query on a proprietary data set, right? These sorts of things you can then plug in to your agent to give it more capabilities. Maybe you're going to call an API from another service. So you could have a one agent that is going to give you a daily briefing, and one of the tools it's got is going to call a weather API to get the weather forecast. So that tool is then just a very specific piece of functionality that you can plug into your agent. Memory. So for the more sophisticated agent design, you also want to kind of specify, like, does the model remember what's already been done? And if so, in kind of what way does it remember that? Or is it just a blank slate every time? So if you're building a chatbot, or if you're building an agent with chat-like functionality in it, then memory is definitely going to be important because you want it to remember the conversation that you've had. In other cases, it's less important. And then finally, output. So we're quite used to getting just free text or kind of structured text out of LLMs, ChatGPT, Claude. In an agent, you can actually get the agents to output a structured, effectively like a JSON. So you can have integers, text, you know, um, binary true false things, or kind of like discrete categories, and it can output information in that way, which is really, really useful if you are then wanting to put that information into a spreadsheet, or you want to put it into an API call, or other kind of areas where you need to have kind of like exact data matching. So AI steps, there's kind of a lot in there, but when you think about like all the things you can do, these are kind of like what you want to think about as you're setting up your AI steps. For your logic, then this will all be sort of like fairly kind of obvious stuff if you've done any even like basic coding. So you can have loops where you kind of like iterate over the same steps a certain number of times. As you saw in the example I had, I was going through a meeting invite and I was running the same set of steps for every external guest. You can have different paths. So you can say like, hey, if I get an email from Bob, send it down this path. If I get an email from Julie, send it down this other path. If it's from anyone else, do something else. So you can have like different routes depending on certain criteria. And you can have delays. So you could say, hey, when I get this email, then wait, X amount of time and then do something. So like, quite similar to the triggers. Some of the triggers, time-based ones, you could say, hey, X amount of time before something happens, then do this. So as I mentioned, like, any kind of agent or workflow you're building is then just combining all of these steps in novel ways. And it's that sort of, these kind of agent builders are really just giving you a Lego set that you can go and build all sorts of wonderful things out of. So again, like, I'll just talk you briefly through this kind of like more simple agent to give you a sense of what's going on here. You've got a trigger which says 4 hours before a meeting. It's then looping, it's pulling all the guests out of that meeting invite. And for each guest, it's then saying like, hey, if it's an internal guest, forget about it, don't do anything else. If it is an external guest, so it's someone I don't work with, at Hustle Badger, then look at the emails we've recently sent each other, look at any meetings we've had, look at their LinkedIn profile, so gather a bunch of information on them. And then there's an AI step here, which basically says like, hey, given all that information, write a little briefing email, and then I send it to myself in Gmail. So that then means that I get a briefing for any meeting I've got coming up, and I don't need to worry about doing that, like, having a mad scramble like 5 minutes before my meeting starts. So this is super useful. This is one that I use right now. You can get much more complex patterns. And if you're thinking, yeah, oh, agents are this kind of like mystical force that's going to change over the world, you might have something more like this in mind. This is an agent that I built in N8N. What it does is you put a PRD effectively into a particular Google Drive. And then what it will do is it will write a LinkedIn post, and it will also write some release notes for that. And you can see both of these kind of two pathways. You've got like two kind of sides to this agent, and you could have more, right? You could do like every piece of launch or go to market, copy that you wanted out of a PRD. But for each of those, it's generating the initial content. So I've got one AI step here generating the first draft of a LinkedIn post. Then I've got an evaluator. So this agent is then saying like, hey, is this draft good enough? Does it meet these criteria? Does it have a compelling hook? Does it seem really logical? Is it really concise? And that agent is then deciding whether it's good enough to post, in which case it kind of writes it up as a document, or if not, it's sending some feedback to an optimizer agent, like an editor, which is going to take this post, is going to write some revisions to it and send it back to the evaluator. So this loop is then going to run as many times as it needs to get the kind of the best quality output that I want. So same process down here, evaluator and optimizer loop, but they're doing it for release notes. So you can start to build up much more curious, sorry, much more complex agents in this kind of way. So this flow here, this is not this is built in N8N, and this is just a screenshot of N8N's interface. So I've cut out some of the kind of the menus and stuff around the edges, but this is why it looks like this and looks a little bit different from the relay one. But you can see this looks more complicated than N8N. I see, Mela, you've got your hand up. If you wouldn't mind just dropping your question to the chat, that'd be great. Thanks. So a few different tools then you can use for building AI agents. If you're looking to build simple ones, I'd start with something like Relay or Zapier. Again, personal favorite, Relay. It's just got a very, very clean UI set up and very, very easy to get into and use. If you're looking to create more complex flows, then N8N and Gumloop are kind of the go-to tools that everyone's using. N8N is probably getting slightly higher mind share as far as I can see, and also has it's a little bit cheaper to get going, and you can also, because it's open source, you can run it locally on your machine, which takes a little bit of setup, but then means that you can run it for free, right? You don't need to be paying a kind of license fee for a cloud version. So yeah, I'd start on Relay if you are just getting going, and then if you're starting to get stuck, you're wanting to create even more complex agents, then look at N8N. A few tips then, if you're starting to build agents, start small. So even if you've got kind of grand designs about what your agent's going to do, how it's going to be an extra colleague, how it's going to, cut your workload by half, do start small. As with any digital product, like get something basic working and then build it out and add functionality. It's, as the kind of scope increases and the complexity increases, you're just making everything more difficult, from how it all fits together to doing QA and everything else. And so I'd, make sure you get the basics working, and then you can just iterate it from there. Map out your flow first. So it's very easy to have an idea for an agent and then start building it, and then get halfway through building it and then realize that actually this just isn't going to work in the way that you think it will. So good practice is just to kind of get a sense of like once you've got an idea, think through the steps that you would build and just sketch those out very simply on a piece of paper. I learned this lesson as I was trying to build myself a meal planning agent. I was like, oh, I hate meal planning every week. I don't know what to cook. I'm like an agent, it'll be easy. And actually, as I started building it, I just realized that the process of working out, of coming up with a meal plan was really difficult because you oscillate, you kind of switch between these two modes of doing research to get inspiration and then actually picking the thing that you want to cook and then working out the ingredients. And I just could not map this out in any sensible way. And if I'd actually mapped it out first, I would have realized that building the thing that I wanted to was impossible. So save yourself some time, get a kind of like high level sketch of what you're building, of what you're thinking of before you actually kind of dive into one of the tools and start building it. Okay. Connections. Like agents are all about the connections with other services. Can you connect to your email, your Slack, your Jira, your, everything else. So if you're playing around with personal productivity, then that shouldn't be a problem. Like they're all gonna connect to Gmail. They'll all, that's fine. But if you're using these in a work context, then this is going to be the biggest barrier for you building stuff because you're probably going to have, firstly, procurement getting in the way of you getting access to one of the tools, and then IT security, making it more or less difficult for you to actually connect your agent to anything sensible for it to be useful. And if you can't connect these agents to other tools, then they're useless. In the same way that if you onboard someone and don't give them access to any of your tooling, they're not going to be very productive. Same with your agents. Um, Defining good. Yeah. I mean, as soon as you start using these LLM steps, then of course the output is going to be non-deterministic. And you've got to have a sense then of what good is and what good enough is. Getting the perfect output every time from an LLM step requires a lot of fine tuning. And so you want to have a sense of, how good does it need to be useful? But also you want to have a sense of like, how can I test this in a kind of, way that allows me to test some of the edge cases and so on. Yeah. And the other thing to bear in mind is like testing. You can test individual steps as well as whole flows, which is really, really useful. It makes it much easier to test the agents in many ways than it is to test like um, you know web apps, something like that. But because these agents are running, when they're triggered, and that might not be when you do something, it's very easy for them to run like lots of times and burn through credits, send loads of emails, like do things at a scale that you have not anticipated, which is generally bad. So if you've got maybe an agent that runs, does something for every guest in a meeting coming up, and you've got a big workshop coming up. Yes, this happened to me. Then suddenly it's going to do research on 20 people, 25 people, and that's going to burn a load of credits. Or if want it to send emails to everyone in an email list, and you haven't set the filters correctly, if you want to send emails to everyone in a spreadsheet, then you could suddenly end up spamming like a ton of people emails. So you want to be really careful about these edge cases. Okay. I see a few questions coming through, so I'm just going to pause here to kind of answer some of these questions. So Abby's asking, do you have examples of companies that you feel are using agents really well to solve problems? Um, yeah, I think that a lot of companies are using agents in quite kind of they're using them as like a tool to help them do little things, like lots of little things, I think, rather than having kind of massive, agents that are kind of doing everything or doing like very complicated things. So often what you're seeing is them doing, customer research and reporting, hey, when you get a customer does this thing on the website or sends you this kind of email, can you flag this so we can action it really, really quickly? Or can you make sure that we don't drop kind of routine admin about team stuff that needs to get done or emailing clients about things or sending out release notes because that is all automated. So I'd say those are kind of some of the most compelling and kind of actually useful use cases at the moment. Um, and then I think there are definitely people who are experimenting with much more complicated flows. So classic flows might be like, hey, can you search a particular thread on Reddit, use that to come up with some ideas for blog posts, brainstorm, write that blog post up into a structure, research it, then write each of the sections, then evaluate it, and then get ready to post. That could be one agent flow that might have multiple AI steps in. And you can set those up, but you're then just building like a very complex system with lots of individual AI steps, which are individually non-deterministic. So testing that system and getting it to a state where it's really usable is going to require a lot of work. And you need to consider this to be effectively like building internal software. You're just building that internal software in a drag and drop no code way. So um, I think that's how I think about it. Okay. Um, Next question from Mark. It's a question on security for companies with sensitive data. How is data privacy and security accounted for in these products, both in terms of how tools like NAN access and use your data and the LLM APIs they send data to? What level of control do we have here? Yeah, I mean, look, this is the first question that everyone asks. So you will find with their professional accounts, both for the APIs and in the agents, they will have provisions around, keeping your data secure and private and not sharing it and not training their models on it and so on and so forth. You're really going to have to ask your own security people to go through the terms and the conditions in like a lot of detail if that's something you're concerned about. If it's something where you're like, well, it's not that big a deal, actually what we're doing is like not that kind of confidential, it's going to be fine. But if you're working in security or you've got a kind of just a culture of high security or you are working on like extremely proprietary stuff, then you want to be very careful about this for sure. Okay, so if you want to learn more about agents, then I'm happy to answer questions in the chat now if you've got them. But as I mentioned, we have got a new course, a live course on AI agents coming out. This is a 4-week course. We run through everything from building like very simple agents, like the one that I kind of showcased here, the kind of the meeting briefing one, getting you going, through to much more complicated systems built in NAN using humans in the loop to review what you're doing and check things are okay before continuing, building your own RAG systems so you can take advantage of proprietary data sources, multi-agent flows like the one that I showed you in NAN, where you've got agents working in parallel or agents determining the routing. You've got evaluator optimizer systems as well. And we also look at kind of more advanced kind of capabilities and agent kind of techniques. So using MCPs, self-hosting, LLM judgment, that kind of thing as well. If you're interested in that, then very easy to find the AI agent course on our website, or you can from the top menu, or this is the URL for it, and it kicks off in a couple of weeks. Okay. I'll just be answering kind of any final questions coming through the chat here. Julian's asking, is there a way to dry run a credit count estimate so that you have an idea how many you're burning by step, by flow, and before you go into production? Yes, absolutely. So if you look at Relay and they're very transparent about exactly that. So you can test your flow like one step at a time, and it will tell you how many credits you use for each step. you can then run, a whole test flow and it will tell you how many credits you use for that whole flow. And then when it's running in production or on kind of smaller test runs, you can see every time it runs how many credits it's going through. Say Relay does have a pretty good free tier, so you can do quite a lot of playing around and in that before you need to upgrade. If you really kind of start using it, consistently, build lots of flows, run lots of flows, you can burn through that, very easily too. So yeah, you want to be careful, but yeah, um, you can definitely audit all of that stuff and have an idea of costs up front. Okay. Um, Question from Bhavana. If one is building a multi-agent product, is it better to call on agents individually? Um, or sorry, is it better to, yeah, so is it better to call like all of your agents in one flow or split them up into different flows? I think that's basically the question. Um, that's not actually going to make a difference, because the way that the credits work is that they work on API usage effectively underlying. So it doesn't matter whether in Zapier when they were just doing step by step pricing. That sometimes made a difference. You sometimes wanted to like bundle all of your steps into one workflow, so that it only counted as one run of a workflow. With the kind of move to using LLMs and AI APIs, yeah, the more important things like how often are you calling the AI steps? So you don't want to call them for steps which you don't need to, and you can just use simple logic for. And you then want to be using the kind of the cheapest model that is effective. Okay, another question from Abby. So, as you say, agents are non-deterministic. Um, it says, yeah. Any advice on using another step to ask AI standardized or QA questions? Any insights from experience? Yeah, I think this is a huge topic in its own right, right? Like, how do you evaluate these systems in a um, very basic sense? I would just think about this as QA. So think about this as, what does the happy path look like? Yeah, and the kind of, success. And then think through, be a good engineer, think through like some edge cases and be like, okay, what would happen if this happened, this happened, this happened? Like, what are kind of the three, four most obvious failure modes you can think of? If you're just doing personal productivity tools, that is probably going to be enough. If you are putting something into production where this is going to be powering client interactions or this is going to be somehow exposed to other people, then you probably want to think about how can you do a more robust analysis of how the agent is performing. Um, but to do that, you're probably going to have to set up some kind of like automated or coded QA of your system, right? So, but again, just start from first principles in QA is the best place. Like what does good look like? What does bad look like? Can you get it into a kind of zone where it's like good enough, it's not failing catastrophically? Okay, and then look at from that point on, if you in that kind of like it's good enough, your quality is there. Actually, more important is how is this affecting your metrics? So how is this affecting engagement, user satisfaction, the impact that you want it to have? Okay, Vivian's got a question. What's the best way to estimate the ROI of introducing an agent? So N8N and some of these tools actually have calculators kind of built in where they will kind of estimate for you the amount of time that you've saved. So if you're looking at pure time savings, then that is one way of doing it. Um, Otherwise, I think you're down to kind of doing your own calculation of this sort of thing about, if you're automating a process, how long would it take you to do each of these steps manually? Can you just kind of put a rough estimate on each of that? And then how often are you doing this task or how often is the company doing this task? And again, then seeing how long that takes. And that's something then if you've got kind of, once it's up and running, you'll be able to see how often the agent is being triggered and you'll be able to estimate the kind of the amount of time saved and therefore the amount of cost saved. Julian, question, can you pull in process diagrams from Visio or similar and then activate and configure the steps? I'm afraid I am not familiar with Visio, so I don't know. But all of these tools do have template systems, and they do have communities, so you can copy flows from other people fairly easily, and you can share them as well. So you know, there's definitely the option that you don't always have to just start from scratch and build them. You do start with something. Okay. Super. Any other questions on agents? Okay, well, we will wrap up here then. As always, if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or drop us a note at HustleBadger, contact at hustlebadger.com. We'd love to answer your questions and help you out.